This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at Montclair.edu. Hello, and welcome to the Washington Monthly. I'm your host, Ann Kim.
And I'm your co-host, Garrett Epps.
In this episode, what the nation is losing with the end of federal funding for public radio and TV.
Something that I think is going to be very unfortunate as we go forward with the loss of federal funding is that many of these organizations in particularly rural communities are really going to be hard pressed to survive.
Our guest is Stephen Bass, who served for 19 years as the president of Oregon Public Broadcasting. Hey, Steve, welcome to the show. It's great to have you.
Thanks for having me.
So if we could start out with you're telling us a little bit more about Oregon Public Broadcasting and about its history. In fact, I found this article published by OPB talking about the origins of the system more than 100 years ago at what's now Oregon State University. And there was just this terrific anecdote about this physics teacher named Jacob Jordan who'd created a homemade 50-watt transmitter. If you could just tell us a little bit more about how
Sure.
OPB got started.
Yeah, OPB was started as a single radio station. KFDJ, I think, was the call sign back then. Now it's KOAC AM 550. Went on the air in 1923, and it was at a time when public radio, or what we know now as public radio, at that point it was educational radio, was sprouting amongst land-grant universities primarily. And it's interesting because I think the early days tended to be in places that were rural and agricultural. Oregon, Iowa, Ohio, Wisconsin, which actually had the earliest station that went back to 1917. They started it effectively as a physics department experiment. And it was in the physics building, and we operated that radio. I mean, that radio station is still on the air today, AM 550. When I got to OPB in 2006, we were still operating from the facility there, the original studios from the 1920s. We eventually had to shut them down a couple of years later because the equipment became more computerized. We had no air conditioning. There were single pane windows. I remember going down there and the host would have to open up the single pane window to get air in to keep the equipment cool. And it would be really bad if the marching band was going by outside, which actually occasionally happens. OPB started over a century ago, as did many contemporary public radio operations, WNYC in New York, Iowa Public Radio, Wisconsin, Ohio State, and a bunch. And then, of course, TV kind of came along later.
So can you tell us a little bit more about what OPB looks like now? I mean, how many member stations do you have? I think I counted more than 60. That might include translators, but give us kind of a sense of who you reach, how many people you reach, who's in your network.
Sure. So OPB operates a network of, I believe it's 16 or 17 FM stations, or AM and FM stations, 2 AMs, the rest are FMs, scattered around the state. So it goes kind of from the Portland metro area all the way east to Idaho, all the way south to Nevada, and on the west side of the Cascades, kind of about to Eugene or Cottage Grove is where things start to peter out. There are 5 TV stations that serve that same area, and then there are loads of these little translators that kind of rebroadcast the signal. There are several dozens of those. So it serves an area, probably about 85% of Oregon's population. The only place that OPB doesn't have broadcast coverage is in that kind of sector in Southern Oregon. But what I would say is the way we thought about it, particularly late in my tenure, was service wasn't just about where you were broadcasting. Service was really about where you were reporting as well. And so OPB has done a lot of coverage of issues all around the region, whether that be directly through its own reporters and producers, or in working with partners. So I think the whole nature of what does service mean in a community has changed over the years from one that's just defined by broadcast.
Well, Steve, let me tell you that just last month, my family and I had a sleepless night in Florence because we were waiting to hear whether the tsunami from the Russian volcanic eruption would cause flooding, and if it was going to, we would have to move quickly to higher ground. And we were listening to KLCC, and I thought, as a KLCC listener, I thought I'd ask you to talk a little bit about the role that public radio and public broadcasting play in emergency communications in places even more rural, say, than
Yeah.
Florence.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is something that's gotten a lot of attention. And, there are things like emergency alerting systems, which ride on the kind of technical infrastructure of public broadcasting. So, for example, the kind of national level emergency alert system kind of comes through OPB and then gets distributed. What I think is more critical in that area is when you combine technology and boots on the ground. And we've seen that at least 2 or 3 times in the last couple of years. I'm thinking of what happened around Asheville, North Carolina after the hurricane. Blue Ridge Public Radio was there. They had a combination of a resilient old technology called FM radio, right? That you can get with a hand crank radio, or you can get in your car, or if you're lucky enough to have internet service, which tends not to, stick around when you're in those kinds of emergency situations, you can stream it on your phone. But more importantly than that, they had the personnel there that could report on what's going on. This also happened in the flooding that occurred where was that? In just the last couple of weeks, was it near San Antonio?
Yeah.
There was a story I just heard the other day about what was happening in Alaska, where the public radio station was reporting on the incoming kind of tsunami. And I think it's the part of public media that people kind of forget. And it's that combination of a resilient technology, some of which is not all that sophisticated, which is actually good in these cases, that is able to reach people, and more importantly, that there are actually people there to report on it. In many communities, public media is the only institution that has any reporters or any people there that can do this, because somebody that's 400, 500 miles away is not really going to be able to do that. They don't understand the nature of the terrain. They don't understand the community. So I think it's something that I think is going to be very unfortunate as we go forward with the loss of federal funding, is that many of these organizations in particularly rural communities are really going to be hard pressed to survive going forward.
I think people don't necessarily realize how big the West is. Oregon is
Yeah,
I think the ninth or 10th largest state in the United States. All the others that are larger are in the West, including Alaska. Oregon's about the size of the United Kingdom. And to reach all those people takes, as your history makes clear, it takes something other than running an antenna out your bedroom window. Um,
absolutely.
and talk about, what opportunities, what is available to people in those rural areas and how much they use public radio as opposed to commercial radio.
I mean, it varies by community, but I will say that when I was at OPB, and I was there for about 19 years till
Mhm.
about a year ago, early on, we had the opportunity to extend our radio coverage, and we did that. And we added radio coverages in communities like John Day and Burns and, uh, you know, Ontario and Astoria on the coast. And I would say people were very thankful for that service. And the beauty of public media is that it's available for free. It's not just that it's non-commercial. It's just like anybody with a radio or a television, just turn it on and it's there. There's no gate, that there's no paywall. It's just there for you. And I think people use it quite a bit. I'll give you one anecdote. I mean, I've traveled a lot around the state, and everywhere I go, I would find lots of fans of OPB. I was in Pendleton, when was that? Probably March. No, it was June, actually, when a lot of this federal funding stuff was going on. Pendleton, Oregon is about 3.5 hours east of Portland. It's out in wheat country, a community of about 17,000 people. Everywhere I went, people were asking about what was the impact that this was going to be on OPB, because it's a lifeline service for people. We were looking at a small community in Oregon, a little further out, called Halfway, where we had a tower that needed to be replaced, and it was going to cost about $150,000, as I recall. And it's a community of, I think it was 288 people. So I asked our membership people, I said, so do we have any members? Do we have any contributors there? Because there's no way to get like radio and TV ratings for Halfway, Oregon, population 288. 50 of the households in that community, and I'm trying to think of 288, were members. So
Wow.
you look at that and you say, okay, it's so easy to look at this and say, this is an urban phenomenon. The only people that care about public radio are in urban areas. And it's not true. And it's hard to measure it because the commercial means of measuring the listening really don't extend to rural areas. So there can be a tendency to think that people don't care. And I think experience is quite the opposite.
Now I saw on your website, you had a page, OPB has a page about the funding cuts that indicates that about 5 million came from the Corporation for Public Broadcasting, which is about 9% of the annual budget. So what does that mean as far as the ability of OPB to deliver the services that it has been delivering, and in particular for these smaller stations that you're talking about?
Well, I'm not there, so I can't tell you precisely what the plan would be, but I would say that, back in the day when I first started in public media, and actually when I first started at OPB, when you would build a budget at the beginning of a fiscal year, the only predictable source of support was effectively what you got from CPB. Everything else was going to be variable. So you'd kind of have to sit there and think, okay, how is our membership going to do? And at that point, we were very reliant on member drives. And are we going to do well in our member drives, or are we going to fall short? So there was a predictability aspect to it. The other thing about it is there's a cash flow element to it as well, which is the way CPB would pay out in a very predictable manner, which is somewhere around November or so, you could count on getting a check for, I think it was probably 75% of your grant, if I'm recalling correctly. And then there was more later on in the year. So for those that were looking at how to manage their cash flow, that was an important infusion. As we look forward, I think that, for organizations like OPB that are financially strong, they are likely to really figure out some way to handle this. I mean, it's going to hurt. 9% is a significant number, but compared to many other organizations where you're talking about 20% or 40%, or in some case, there's a tribal station in Eastern Oregon where it's something like, I think they told me it's 99% of their funding comes from CPB.
Wow.
There's no way to make up for that. So 9% seems like it's $5 million. That's a lot of money. It hurts. But compared to the couple $100,000 that native station gets, that's 99% of their funding, the ability to make up for that is going to be really, really difficult. So I think the larger organizations have some opportunity to figure it out. But I'd also say here is that the way I look at things is that federal funding is among the challenges that public media faces now. It is not the sole challenge. And in some cases, it may not be the biggest challenge, because what we are seeing is a fundamental reordering of the media ecosystem, that we are seeing more people turning to on-demand media. This is particularly true in the television business, where in the month of May, I think it was, streaming and on-demand viewing eclipsed all linear viewing. In other words, all viewing on broadcast, cable, satellite. More of it was on Netflix, Roku, YouTube TV. So if you're in the business of basically being kind of a redistributor of broadcast content, you have a big shift you need to make. So you kind of add those two challenges together, and what's really going to be needed is a significant transformation throughout the ecosystem. And I think that's really where organizations like OPB are focusing right now.
One claim I've seen online is that a lot of smaller stations will actually switch to more NPR content because it's cheaper than having the boots on the ground. Do you see that as a problem?
Well, I see it as an economic solution. But what I fear is that it is not a long-term strategy, because if what we're starting to see now is kind of a splintering of a system where in the past what you could do is to create audience and support by rebroadcasting, in effect, content that people can now get online, how long is that going to hold up? The thing that is truly unique when you think about it is the reporting that is being done on the ground. So I think that's the shift that needs to happen. Now, what organizations may need to do is to think about what do you do in the short term to adjust to this shift from, to have no federal funding, but what are you going to do in the long term? So it's kind of a dual transformation process that I think is going to need to happen. It is not going to be easy.
What is the long term solution? Have you got one for us?
Boy, I think there's some, but I also fear that there is not either a one size fits all solution nor one that is going to work in some of the most remote and rural organizations. I mean, I look at the state of Alaska where public radio in particular is a lifeline. And, many of these organizations are going to lose, 50% or more of their funding. I mean, the only thing that I can think of that would allow them to continue doing what they're doing now is if, for example, the state of Alaska stepped in and said, we'll pick up a larger share. Alaska has long ago defunded public broadcasting. I mean, kind of they've gone through the cycle of oil booms and oil busts. In fact, 1986, I was working for PBS and I was sent up to Alaska to work with all of the public broadcasting stations because they had been defunded from the state. And the stories I heard there about the service in rural communities and people didn't have money to give the station, but they had just gotten a whole bunch of salmon, so they put them on ice and bring them down to the station, and that was their gift. It's really quite a remarkable thing. So I don't see an easy solution for those organizations. In other places, I think what we're going to have to do is to see more consolidation and more kind of common backroom operations. My view is like what we really need is to increase the number of boots on the grounds in all kinds of communities and not to put that at risk. But if you don't have managements and kind of duplicative infrastructure in all of these places, that's probably a fair price to pay for this. We've
Mhm.
seen some of that happen over the years, but I think a lot more needs to happen going forward. And then, of course, I think the public is going to step up a bit more. I know that OPD and other organizations have seen a nice bump in fundraising as a result of this. And I would say, that's important to keep doing that. And the question is that a long-term amount of support or is that short-term? My hope is that it's going to be long-term in nature.
Mhm, mhm. And some of that could depend actually on the state of the economy too, I would imagine, if we get the
Exactly.
all.
Yeah, although it's funny because my experience on the state of economy is, sometimes public media has done well in recessions. And I'll take it back to 2007, 2008, when it was actually 2008 when we had the Great Recession. And we were hunkered down. I mean, we saw our corporate sponsorship stuff just start to plummet. I was worried what was going to happen with membership. And actually what we found was that our membership giving, the amount stayed level. The
Mm,
number of donors increased. So what you had was more people giving a little bit less. So when the economy improved, it actually kind of all went up and it allowed us to start really growing again. So, at times like recession, sometimes people will say, well, I'll stick with OPB, but maybe I can give up the Netflix subscription or whatever. Who knows? I mean, it isn't predetermined, but it is something, the state of the economy is something we need to worry about. Has a big effect on sponsorship. One of the problems that public radio is having now is that change in kind of that shift from linear listening or broadcast listening to podcasts has undercut some of the sponsorship markets. And now, interestingly, as you guys are probably tracking, the podcast market and environment is shifting again. So, the Onion came out with a headline that I've loved. I just saw it the other day again. It says 250 million Americans have yet to book their podcast guest this week.
I saw that.
And it's almost true. Not quite, but almost. As you know, there's a lot out there.
Yes, yes, yes. I completely identified with that remark, that headline.
And here we are on a podcast, right?
Exactly, exactly. So I want to go back to what you're talking about on the journalism and reporting, because I know that that was a priority for you in your tenure as president of OBP, and you grew the journalism staff substantially, and you had your newsroom had some amazing coverage of stories in partnership with ProPublica, but also on your own. You guys covered the decline of the salmon population. You had an expose on problems with the Oregon foster care system. You covered this groundwater contamination by a mining company. Those kinds of huge public service investigations. Are they going to be at risk as well in this new environment? Or how do you go about preserving that sort of hard hitting public service journalism that OPB has done for so long?
That's a really great question. I suspect, just because I know my successor really well and I know what her values are, I really expect that's going to continue at OPB. I think that OPB has seen this as being a very important part of its future in terms of its public service. And I will say that when I came to OPB in 2006, I thought I was being hired to run a television and a radio network. I did not think that within a period of about 5 years, we would be on a path to becoming a primary news source. I kind of thought we would be very much in the public radio mode of like, you'll tune in tomorrow to find out what happened today. And what we found was in the Great Recession, journalism organizations were severely impacted. When I got to OPB, the Oregonian had something like 250 journalists in 2006. I don't know what the number is now, but it's well south of 100. I mean, it's everything has been cut back. And I had people coming to us saying, you guys need to step up. You're the only statewide news organization that is left in Oregon. And we were fortunate because we were doing well financially. And what we were doing was just investing. We'd have a surplus one year. And we'd say, okay, that gives us the confidence to take a risk. Let's hire a couple more reporters. Or we would get a startup grant from CPB or a foundation to get something going. And as compared to others where they would kind of go into the grant, and then at the end of the grant, okay, we can't support it anymore. It was nice while it lasted. We actually were able to keep those things going. Now, they might have to change, but I don't think we had any projects that we got outside funding for where we weren't able to keep the people that we had hired to keep it going. So that was part of the evolution. And I think some of it is just a mindset. And what I think a lot about is in this period when we're going through fundamental change and you don't have CPB any longer, the responsibility for this falls on the CEOs and the boards and the governance structures of these local public media organizations, and also the resources that they have at hand. And I'm hopeful that what people are going to do is to keep the most important aspects in place from an audience service perspective, rather than kind of fall back into we're really in the radio business and we're really just here to kind of, put some NPR stuff on the air and call it good. I don't think that's where the future is leading us.
Let me follow up on that because I think it's a very important point. And I think people listening to our podcast might wonder what can ordinary listeners do to try to help public, beyond writing checks, to try to help their local public radio organizations make the right choices. How can they get involved? What would be constructive and what would not?
Well, I think writing checks or becoming a sustaining donor, if you can do it, certainly helps. I think that in some cases, public media organizations need expertise on their boards of directors. I mean, if they're independent nonprofits and, people have some sort of specific expertise, whether it be media transformation, or they're a CPA and they're really good at financial stuff, volunteering your time and energy is a good way to get involved. I also think just kind of getting to know the people there, reaching out to them, getting to know board members, and offering constructive critiques and suggestions, story ideas. If you've got, you're a source for something and you say, here's something going on, think about how you might reach out to the news operation at your local public radio station. And I think the other one is just spread the word. I mean, the thing I kind of worry about through this whole thing is that the brand of public radio, which to me is not the same as NPR, has kind of been mushed together. And I think that there needs to be some rehabilitation of that brand, if you will, because for many people, the people that don't listen all the time or at all, they have no idea what to think. And I think if people are out there saying, really, there's a lot of good stuff on your local public radio station, you should really check it out online or on the air, that does help.
Well, on that note, that's a terrific note to end on. And Steve, thank you so much for your time. It's really a pleasure to talk to you.
Great to chat with you about this.
Take care. This week's podcast is sponsored by Montclair State University. Located just 12 miles from New York City, Montclair State University is a public research university that's helping students get from where they are now to where they want to be. Nationally ranked for social mobility and Washington Monthly's #1 public institution in New Jersey, Montclair is the state's premier public service institution. Learn more about what makes Montclair a university on the rise at Montclair.edu. That's it for this week from the Washington Monthly. I'm Ann Kim, and on behalf of my co-host, Garrett Epps, thank you for listening. If you like what you heard, don't forget to subscribe to our channel or wherever you get your podcasts. Have a wonderful week.